Old Newgate is designated as a National Historic Landmark, as the first state prison and first charter copper mine in North America. So that alone is huge for its Connecticut significance and its national significance. In terms of its history, it's significant as a really dark part of our history, Connecticut's history in particular. It, imprisoned people into a copper mine.
The history of this site has had some questionable things, like having bears and tanks and everything else, just as a tourist attraction. I think it's much more meaningful to have people here and see what the historical background and really understand why it's here and why it was discontinued as a prison. I remember this as a kid coming here and seeing exactly how exciting it was to be able to look at this piece of history. And I really wanted to see this get opened back up again.
Over time, some of the things that have been lost in terms of the authentic history of Newgate Prison are just a part of its life. So Newgate started in the early 18th century as a mine, and when you then layer upon the use of a prison on top of that, you lose some things related to that initial commercial enterprise. And then when you layer on top of it the tavern and then becoming a tourist site, you've now lost some other component. Certainly being able to go to a place where you can look at this guardhouse, you can look at these prison walls, and it's a tangible place of history that you can touch. The feeling setting is still there for you to experience that.
One of the main things we did was get DECD involved and got permission to have an open house here in 2016. Little did we know what kind of impact that was going to have. We had just a small number of people. We had somebody from the Historic Preservation Office and a couple of other people from East Granby with a whole slew of volunteers. And on a rainy, very, very rainy day in October, we're open for one day. We had over 2,000 visitors show up. This is one of the things that got the state more interested in getting it back open. We were able to prove that there was a big demand for it.
The story of Old Newgate starts first and foremost as a copper mine, simply colonists trying to make a buck mining copper, which was a really valuable metal even at the time. So they heard rumor that there was copper in the area. They started digging. It was never very profitable. They had to ship their copper ore overseas because it was controlled by the monarchy. And so it eventually was a bust. It eventually closed in the 1750s, having opened in 1707. Closed in the 1750s and was abandoned for a few years until the colonial government of Connecticut decided to open it as a prison. They thought that the abandoned caverns would serve as good hard labor and a place for confinement for their criminals. But that being said, it opened as a site for reform to move away from capital and corporal punishment, and then it closed in order to create better prisons. So from the get-go, both beforehand and afterhand, it was a site of reform, which is really important to reflect on in our history. So copper was really valuable then as it is now. Now it's in a lot of our electronics and we use it for countless things. Back then it was used as currency, so the first coin of America was minted at a mine next to ours. It was illegal at the time, so it wasn't considered true currency, but it was circulated as currency. That's the Higley copper coin. Otherwise, it was used for the bottoms of ships, probably ornamental, as always. But those resources weren't really used here because it was oftentimes sent to England as the controlling factor of the mine.
For me, archaeology is real and it tells a wider story. The stories of people that history either chose not to record because they weren't considered important, or portions of the story that may not have fit with the story they wanted to be told. And so there is a lot of that happens at Old Newgate Prison. In terms of the men who were responsible for taking care of the prisoners, for example, this is just one of the many examples that exist. There's men who were responsible for taking care of these prisoners, and they would record what they were feeding them and how they were taking care of them because that was their responsibility, what they had to do.
I think now that we're getting more exhibits dealing with criminal justice, it's becoming an experience where people can understand a little better what some of the prisoners were going through. I think ONG really can offer us some education on how not to treat prisoners, on how we need to refocus on rather than just punitive measures on being able to have people have a role in the outside world afterwards. People left here, they had to buy their way out a lot of times to be able to, to pay the expenses that were incurred on their behalf. This is something that put the prisoners way behind a future. They had a burden to bear in addition to being a convict here. They actually had an economic issue that they had to deal with as well. It made it much harder to succeed.
The first prisoner was John Hinson, and he managed to escape within 18 days. So he was here, no guards. The only person that was in charge of the prisoners was the gentleman across the street who lived there and was deemed the warden, Captain John Beets. So John Hinson escaped supposedly from someone who came and let down a rope to help him get out, is the rumor, the legend. So John Hinson escaped within 18 days. The following year, in 1774, the overseers, those who were in charge of managing the prison, wrote back to the government and said, "Your honors must have heard, all of the prisoners have escaped." The officials quickly realized that having the prisoners mine, which was their intention, wasn't successful. The quality of ore wasn't great, but more than that, giving prisoners tools to mine wasn't their smartest idea. So they quickly abandoned that and simply used the mine to house prisoners. So prisoners lived in the mine in bunk beds, and anything that they could build on top of their roofs, on top of their heads, so that they weren't dripped on all night long.
When we look at the archaeology, particularly in their food remains, what we notice is that these men were starving. They had broken apart bones multiple times to get every bit of nutrition from the marrow, every little piece of meat that they could from those little scraps that they were given. So we see this inconsistency between what somebody who is supposed to have responsibility is saying in paper and then the actuality of what's happening.
So that was what they did, and they slept down there from 4 o'clock in the afternoon to 4 a.m. And at 4 a.m. they would be brought above ground, shackled, always shackled, and put to work making nails and shoes, any sort of hard labor that would turn out a product that would make a profit for the prison. At 4 p.m. they would be probably given a meal and sent back down for the remaining of the night. It was always dark down there. They weren't allowed to have candles, and dark and wet and always 52 degrees.
So the one artifact that a lot of people, if you know about it, bring up about Newgate is during one excavation about 10 years ago, a die was found, like one of a pair of playing dice for games. And it was probably prisoner made, fashioned out of animal bone with little black carbon dots put into it. And I think that now expresses another side of what the prisoner's life must have been like. So, while we think of the last story where they're suffering, we can also see that they were trying to live at the same time and enjoy themselves like most people want to do. And so this piece, this little item of gaming tells another story of what may have been going on here.
So all of the buildings and the structures that we have are a result of their continual experiment that was Newgate. This was a trial and error. It was the first state prison, and they really didn't know what they were doing. So what we see today, the ruins that are left are remnants of these poor guards really just trying to do their job with little resources and keep the prisoners in.
But history is a function of the person who holds the pen. So, the people who get to write down on paper and document what's happening have the power to control what we know about what happened. And it also tends to be through the lens of somebody else in terms of what they want you to know about what happened.
That being said, the ideology that went into Old Newgate is really is seen as a stepping stone for our current system. So it opened as a site of reform. They had a church. They decided to make the prisoners go to work because not working was considered a sin. So these ideas really play into what our current system does. They kept all the prisoners housed together and then determined that that wasn't benefiting anybody. The prisoners were learning each other's crimes, attempting escape together. So then they moved towards solitary cells, which is more of what we see today. I think it also set the standard for just what crimes are and what is sentencing and what crimes are imprisoned and versus not, both for better or for worse. So there was crimes that were sentenced to Newgate, like being a loyalist, just simply someone who is loyal to the British Crown. And those people were imprisoned, whether they were fighting in the war or not. And so I think that really speaks to who do we criminalize and why, which is something we should always ask ourselves, even in today's age.
When I think about what we see and evidence of what's happening in Newgate, there's similarities and there's differences. So with the examples that I've talked about, when we look at the dice, there's entertainment, there's enjoyment, there's people still trying to live their lives even though they may be in this environment that they did not want to be in, is not their home, but they're trying to make themselves feel comfortable there. And at the same time, we see this, really, when we talk about this starving hunger going on, of the loss of comforts and the inhumanity that can sometimes exist.
Right now, East Granby has been very involved in some programs here, and also people from West Suffield. These are immediate areas to ONG. We'd like to see that expanded. There have been people from Simsbury, other areas around that have participated in a lot of the programs. I think it's really important for not only the site to work with the community, but for the community to actually have the experience of having this wonderful asset right here where it is. It's a cultural opportunity. It's an educational opportunity for the students that come here and volunteer, and it's an economic opportunity in terms of attracting business to the area.
I believe that everything we do, from our interpersonal lives to the way we deal on a larger political stage, has based in context of history. The idea of how can we possibly know where we're going unless we know where we have been. And so I think understanding, in terms of Newgate's situation, how we have incarcerated people in the past, what they went to prison for, how they were treated here, and how we do that now, it provides a context for understanding how we have gained in humanity and where there's still room for improvement.